Hello. Hi, my name is Gwen Michele with the Delco CPR leadership team. Today I would like to introduce our speakers who have personal experiences at George W. Hill Correctional Facility. It is very important that we listen to the experiences of the people who were incarcerated at George Hill and their family members. You can't know what it's like until you've been behind bars at this facility. How programs look on paper is very different from what happens on the inside. Some speakers were incarcerated at George Hill very recently, and some in years past. This facility has been under private management for nearly 20 years. First with the GEO Group for a decade, then another private company, Community Education Centers, then GEO Group again. There have been issues across all of these years of private management, and many of the staff had stayed the same. Today we have a lineup of speakers that includes 4 people formerly incarcerated at George Hill, their family members, and 1 former correctional officer. We have statements from several people who shared their stories with our team who could not attend today. Their statements will be read by Delco CPR team members with pseudonyms and with the permission of the people who shared their stories. We want to thank all of our speakers for having the courage to share their stories with us today. Your experiences are most important as we consider how to ensure a humane correctional facility that truly provides rehabilitation and treatment to the people behind its bars. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gwen. Our first speaker is Joseph Durbin.
Good afternoon. My son Jonathan has been incarcerated at George W. Hill at least 4 separate occasions beginning in 2014. As of today, he's served over 407 days. And he's been in the most recent incarceration started June 18th of this year. John's background, he gained a history of mental illness such as bipolar disorder, and he had a previous suicide attempt. He is currently housed in general population, and during his recent period of incarceration, it took John 9 weeks to get his medication. After 2 weeks of being in George Hill, John got to see a psychologist, and then an additional 7 weeks before he was seen by a psychiatrist. I visit my son weekly, and previously, when John was there, we could go 2 times a week, on Tuesdays and Saturdays. Now we're only limited to 1 day a week, Monday nights. My interaction with the guards and other staff members, that the guards are strict about observing their rules, but they're professional and respectful with us. The only other indication of other staff that I had an interaction with was John's counselor, Carol, who did call me from the outside, and I see her as doing a great job at allowing John to see his important aspects of his circumstances while at George W. Hill. My impression of the staff over at George W. Hill is they're always putting out fires. They're overworked, generally disinterested in the problems being experienced by their inmate charges. John doesn't talk a lot about, when we visit him, he doesn't talk about what goes on in there. He keeps positive. He talks about what's going on outside. He's got hope of getting out, and hope that the system's going to work for him and help him out. But when you have a disease, bipolar illness, it's hard. The worst part that John said was the filthy bathrooms and the pervasive stench of urine and other unclean conditions. He's completed certificates in 2 classes there. He's involved in the Thresholds program, which is great for him, Bible study. And he's also counseling with Carol again, and it has also enrolled in an anger management class. My opinion is that people at George W. Hill haven't done much to help John. John's done what he had to do for himself. That they're just basically caring about warehousing people and not individuals. When I asked what he does most of the day, he says he just spends most of the day hanging out, and then he goes to his scheduled classes or whatever he has to do. It's been hard on our family. My other two sons, it's just tough on them. They won't go see John out there, but they do like to talk to him on the phone and stuff like that. It makes it tough on all of us. When John was incarcerated the first time, he had an essay he wrote, and I'm going to apologize for language a little bit, but we're all adults here, I think. We can handle this. It reeks of piss. The hole in the ground, I wonder if I can see hell through it. Then China, then skies. I lay on a pale sky and form a bench under me. Without a box of chocolates, commence sleep. I wake up, and it still reeks of piss. Hungry, I fall asleep. I wake up, and it still reeks of piss. I get up to stretch my legs. I got caught. I'm busted. My hand was in the cookie jar and smacked red. I'm now herded and characterized for the rest of the farm when I wake up. My hair is a hurricane of its own nature across the land of my scalp. My eyelids sag. They gave me back my vision earlier, so I can witness the inferno I just placed myself in. Walking, it reeks of piss. I'm told I deserve to die and I have no more power. The compass is broken and I know I am too. My person is raised, none of my bones are broken. I tell my parents I'm sorry. My dad cries. I cry horrendously. I hate crying, I really do. It's a bad habit. So I was biting my nails, but I haven't been fed as of late. I have to digest something edible. I need to sidebar here. John's first meal at George W. Hill was a bologna sandwich with Lindt and Staples. And he had iced tea that had phlegm spit into it. So that was his first meal, so he didn't really eat for a while. And in conclusion, I just like to say that I hope that we can make a change at George Hill.
Right.
Our next speaker is Suzanne Wallace.
A little short, so I want it to be able to be heard. Our daughter Janine passed away at George Hill 3 years ago due to horrific neglect and inhumane treatment. Protocols in place and protections to safeguard her were not enforced. Lack of management, supervision, accountability, as well as falsifying records and reports led to her death. Egregious violations of policy and procedure caused this tragedy. We continue to grieve her loss every single day. Janine had mental health issues. She had extreme anxiety and paranoia. She was awaiting a hearing in George Hill because of missed probation meetings. Janine was not a criminal. She had no history of violence and no substance use. She never hurt anyone. She developed a brain disease in her late 20s, not brought on by herself, no different than cancer or heart disease. Yet, she was treated as a hardened criminal in George Hill. Instead of a prompt hearing, Janine languished in George Hill for 2 months without required mental health attention. She was assessed by the facility's psychiatrist, who documented her severe mental illness and need of treatment. Upon investigation, and despite having no history of violence and no documented misbehavior at the prison, Janine was put in solitary confinement, meaning 23 hours of being isolated daily in a cell. It was discovered that Janine was denied basic necessities. Her mattress, pillow, sheets, blanket, and towel were all removed. They threw food into her cell. Janine pleaded to see doctors and cried out that she was cold. She endured this for 52 days. The final 3 days isolated for a continuous total of 72 hours because it was a holiday weekend. One can only imagine how her mind was tortured continually with such treatment. During the investigation, it was discovered that there was no documentation of why she was put in solitary and no approval of this action. If someone is placed in solitary, a review and an assessment must occur within 3 days with the warden to determine if segregation is warranted, followed by a review every 7 days thereafter. Also, daily medical visits were required. None of these requirements took place. When the warden was questioned, he responded as though he had no responsibility for what occurred at George Hill. Isn't that his job? He even admitted that he was unaware of Janine's solitary confinement. Solitary confinement is designed for someone who poses a serious threat to others or security, not for someone like Janine, who was a threat to no one. Janine was 97 pounds, 5'2". She had grab marks and bruises on her arms, legs, and back. When she was pleading for help and could no longer stand the horrific conditions and taunting, she told the guard she was going to choke herself. The guard said, "Go ahead." Janine covered the window with paper, and the guard went to breakfast. The guard did not follow suicide prevention guidelines, which demanded continuous observation of Janine. Nobody observed her after the threat, and she died by suicide. Remember, Janine had no sentence. She was awaiting a hearing for missed probation meetings. The missed probation meetings were because she had paranoia and she was running away from her supposed attackers. Guards seemed to be able to treat inmates as inhumane as they wished, with minimal oversight from all levels. Rather than observing inmates, especially those with mental health issues, the guards were found to be falsifying log records. People with mental illness, especially with no history of violence, should not be treated the same as criminals. At least 40%, and today I heard the number is even higher, of the inmates have mental illness. 10 months ago, an agreement was made with our family to include 11 new policies and revisions to the suicide prevention and restricted housing procedures. With the previous lack of oversight and accountability, we have no way of knowing if anything has changed. We appeared before County Council 2 times to plead for their interest and investigation into how George Hill actually operates day to day. They have a responsibility to Delaware County taxpayers who are paying for this horrendous $50 million contract with GEO. We never received any follow-up information from County Council. There have been at least 2 more documented suicides at George Hill since Janine's passing. There may have been more that we are not aware of. It is extremely difficult to obtain this information. We were also promised a meeting with the prison board in order to be assured that the 11 new policies were actually implemented. We are still trying to schedule such a meeting. It is up to the county to be aware and actually approve the management of George Hill and the treatment of inmates. It does not appear that this responsibility is taken seriously or again overseen. Accountability and oversight were sorely lacking 3 years ago, and since there have been more suicides, we question if anything has changed. Financial considerations of managing this facility are of concern to many. However, does anyone even know or care about the daily activities within the walls? and how human lives are treated, especially the vulnerable ones? Since the prison board has not provided any verification or shown any interest in this, it is time for an outside, independent examination of what is actually taking place in this house of horrors. Our investigation uncovered gross lack of training, gross lack of supervision, and gross lack of accountability at all levels.
I'd like to invite Katy Virtue to read a written statement.
Hi, my name is Katy Virtue Guidati, and I will be sharing Vicky's story. My daughter is currently in there since July 9th, still waiting for sentencing for a DUI charge. Her PO has a detainer on her for a pending charge of DUI from medical marijuana and 2 Xanax pills from an old prescription she had 8 months ago. She had car trouble and was waiting at Royal Farms in Chichester for me, her mother, to pick her up. She dozed off while waiting, and someone called the police. The police came and they assumed she was on drugs because she was sleeping, and they charged her with DUI. The PO will not release her until she is sentenced in the DUI case. They make you plead guilty because you don't want to stay in GWH any longer than you need to. If you fight your case, you're stuck there for months. While in prison, she has been tortured. Below are the following issues that she has had to deal with so far. She was beat up by another girl and put in the hole for 6 days because she defended herself. She had a hearing before a judge in GWH, and she was found not guilty of fighting, so she was put back in the general population. During those 6 days, she had no TV, no radio, barely any food, was in the cell for 23 hours, was let out for 1 hour to shower, and had to wear a red jumpsuit. When I visited her, she had a red jumpsuit on, which is embarrassing in front of the rest of the inmates, and we could only sit in a certain section to visit because red jumpsuits are considered a high threat to others. It's a warning system to stay away from those types of inmates. They provide no pillows or a mattress that is barely there. The bunk beds are broken. An inmate on my daughter's block broke her leg trying to get out of the top bunk because the side rail was broken. When my daughter sent her clothes to laundry, most were stolen upon return, so now she washes them in the sink in the cell and tries to hang them to dry. But she gets reprimanded for hanging her clothes up on the makeshift clothesline and punished with a lock-in all day for it. There was no AC for days. It was hot and humid with no air circulation. Understaffed, most weekends guards won't show up for work, so the inmates stay locked in for most of the weekend. My daughter took a mental health test and scored way too high, so they took her off her depression medication until they received her medical records to see what type of mental health issues she has. She filed 3 grievances, but was still not seen by the doctor there or put back on the depression medication. It has now been 3 weeks. The COs are racist and dehumanize you. They treat you like an animal. I wouldn't let my dog stay there for a night. The first week she was in intake, they threatened her with a turtle suit, which is a straitjacket. They laughed at her because you go crazy when you're jammed in the cell with 10 to 12 other girls. My daughter smokes cigarettes, so I can only imagine the nicotine withdrawal that you go through. I don't understand why they don't give you nicotine patches to combat the anxiety from not being able to smoke. You have to pee in cups all together in the same room. They mixed her test up with another girl's. They started to detox my daughter from heroin, when in fact it was the other girl who was sick all over the place. My daughter said there was throw up on the floor while in intake from those that are detoxing from heroin. My daughter is 21 months clean from heroin, so she didn't need to detox with Suboxone. She insisted on taking another urine test to prove that she didn't need the detox meds. The nurse ended up being her middle school nurse at Garnet Valley, and so she helped her and had her taken off the meds. There were toilets overflowing in the cell. The same girl from before told a CO that my daughter had K2 on her, so they charged her cell, threw her to the ground, ripped out her nose ring after they originally allowed her to keep it in because it was hard to remove. They tore her cell apart, they threw everything onto the floor, They took her down to a holding cell that had a hole in the ground, apparently for the inmates to urinate in. My daughter said it was the grossest smelling holding cell filled with flies. She had to pee in a cup again so they could see if she had K2 in her system. There was no K2, no drugs in her cell, and my daughter was put back in her own cell again. The COs finally admitted that the other girl was spreading a rumor. The other girl is now in the hole for telling the inmates and the COs that my daughter had K2. It was her way of seeking revenge on my daughter for being a good inmate who caused no problems. I called a deputy of security about a CO there that would constantly harass my daughter. I consider her a racist. She would keep threatening to throw her in the hole because she had K2 on her. But of course, the deputy of security flipped on me and told me it was all untrue. I never heard from him again because everything I was complaining about was the truth. The phone system is very poor. I can hardly hear my daughter on the phone most times she calls. They need programs to educate these girls instead of having them sleep all day, play cards, and watching TV. This is why they reoffend again and again. There is so much chaos in there because all the inmates sit around bored, some have mental issues and pick on each other. They need some type of constructed schedule during the day plus medical treatment for mental issues. My daughter said if they know you have a mental health issue, you are put on confinement in the medical unit. Last week, there was a rumor that a girl hung herself because she was depressed, apparently brain dead. I don't know how true this is and which hospital she may be at, but this is the rumor going around. My daughter knew her and was on Unit 9 with her. Of course, this is traumatizing to my daughter. The whole experience in the prison is traumatizing for her, and when she gets out, I will have to seek treatment for her for post-stress from this experience. My daughter was told by several inmates that it is much better to go upstate than to sit in that prison at George Hill. Thank you, from a mother of a female inmate at George W. Hill.
Thank you, Katie. We'd like to invite Michele Sebastian Downey to read a written statement.
Good afternoon. My name is Michele Downey, and I will be sharing Mary's story. Mary shared her perspective with the Delco CPR team over the summer. Her son David and a family friend were both incarcerated at George Hill. David was incarcerated at George Hill for a period of 12 days in June of 2014. He was arrested in a parking lot outside of a restaurant and charged with underage drinking, disorderly conduct, making terroristic threats, and possession of illegal drugs. At the time of his arrest, David was under the care of a doctor for mental health issues and had loose pills of his properly prescribed medications in his pocket. As a concerned parent, Mary attempted to visit David twice during the 12-day period of his incarceration. Mary recalled being taken into a cafeteria-like area near the visiting area where she received pat-down frisks on both occasions, and both times she was denied entry. On her first appearance, they denied her entry into the facility because she was not wearing a bra. She explained to the guards that she hadn't worn a bra since the 1970s, but it didn't change the guards' decision. Clearly they could tell she was not wearing a bra. She left the facility without speaking to her son. Mary returned to George Hill a few days later wearing a bra and the exact same blouse she had worn on the previous visit. Again, she was denied entry to the facility. This time, the guards told her that her blouse was too revealing. Mary explained that it was the exact same top she had worn on her first visit, but once again, it did not change the guards' decision. This time, Mary asked to speak to a shift commander, and a higher-ranking correctional officer appeared, discussed the situation, and sided with the other guards. Once again, Mary was denied access to this facility, and she did not get to visit with her son. Mary admits to being angry after this second refusal, and she stated that the guards told her to calm down or she might be locked up too. Another guard mentioned that if she didn't calm down, her son wouldn't get the 2 rolls of quarters she brought for him. Needless to say, Mary did not want to make things worse for David, so she left, not seeing her son again. Mary indicated that many of the guards were respectful and helpful, particularly those in the parking lot area. She did make it clear that she felt that some of the auxiliary security guards standing around in the visiting room area had attitudes towards visitors and were skeptical as to whether family members or friends belonged there. Regardless, Mary indicated that visitors' movements at the facility were severely restricted. Because of Mary's awareness of her son's mental health issues and her concern for his welfare, she had extensive contact with many members of George Hill's administrative staff, including medical staff, cell block counselors, and facility administrators. For the most part, the administrative staff personnel Mary interacted with were professional and polite. At the time of his incarceration, David was prescribed Klonopin by his personal psychiatrist, but his much-needed medication was not provided once he arrived at George Hill. At the time of his arrest, Mary wanted to get David placed in the facility's psychiatric treatment cell block, but David felt safer going to the general population cell block due to concerns about the staff there. When Mary was asked about the worst part of this experience for her, she responded, "The stress and worry of trying to get him out of there." She feels David should have received treatment rather than incarceration. Mary did say that some of the staff gave David more attention because of my intervention. David's ultimate transfer to Eagleville for rehabilitation was accomplished with Mary's insistence and constant involvement. Like other former inmates we've spoken to, David suffered some negative bail issues. Mary went down to the media courthouse on a Friday and paid $2,400 to have David released. Nevertheless, David remained at George Hill until the following Monday. At first, Mary was told there are no releases from George Hill on the weekends. Later, she was informed that the authorities had discovered a previously unknown warrant. These mixed messages were confusing and frustrating. In general, Mary described David's experiences at George Hill as traumatic. She stated that, quote, David went into a semi-catatonic state upon arrival at the jail, and he hardly ate for the entire 12 days that he was there, end quote. At one point, he was doing so poorly that one of his cellies or cellmates called Mary to inform her of his distress. David saw fights and violence between inmates while there, but he managed to stay uninvolved in these violent episodes. To this day, he is reluctant to talk about his experiences at George Hill.
Thank you, Michele. We'd like to invite Brother Brock to read a written statement.
Please remember, we're talking about a privatization company who's making millions and millions of dollars in profit without putting any money back into this system. As we listen to these horrific stories from these people, clearly there's an issue economically. It looks like I have two different stories to read. My name is Brother Brock. I will be sharing Carl's story. And remember, the names have been changed. Carl shares his story at Delco team earlier this year. It's been about 11 years since Carl has been incarcerated at the George Hill facility. Today, at 41 years old, he is thriving a full-time truck driver's position. However, this story is about before those times. His earlier charges were all misdemeanors. He was sentenced for retail theft and trespassing and possession of heroin, opioid, cocaine. Carl has several DUIs, which he lost his license for years ago due to that. He was a non-violent offender. Since his last incarceration, Carl has completely rebuilt his life. He has mended ties with his 17-year-old daughter, stopped selling and using drugs, and is now gainfully employed. Yet, it took Carl 10 different stays at George Hill facility, a place that's supposed to be helping people rehabilitate themselves. Why is the conditions at George Hill so inadequate? Carl described his time at George Hill as boring, unpleasant, understaffed guards carry out their jobs milly-milly around. He said people sit in lawn chairs in the television room. Lawn chairs, they don't have enough money to buy regular facility chairs and tables. Carl considered sleeping on a hard paperless mattress as well as with no pillow, another crime. Unpleasant. It's punishment after all, he said. He felt similarly accepting the 10-minute mealtime and having only an hour after dinner to leave your cell to stretch your legs in the day room or the closed courtyard. 2 hours a day spent languishing in the cell. 22 hours a day spending time in the cell with no reading material or television to occupy your time. However, the facility does not provide adequate support for his rehabilitation. Even though Carl was able to start a GED program while incarcerated and he witnessed Alcohol Anonymous meetings occurring in the jail, there were very few opportunities to visit the library regularly, and little did they focus solely on logistical matters for his sentence. Counselors were only available for 5 or 10 minutes at a time, and they only focused on logistical matters such as sentencing. Therapists who could help prepare inmates for making a fresh start once released simply were not available. There was more than enough unoccupied time to participate in educational programs, such as life skill training and job preparation, but such programs were sorely lacking. Carl admits to pervasive feelings of helplessness, guilt, and shame that together with a lack of reform and therapeutic programs made it extremely difficult for him to see the better way of life ahead. Carl's willingness to work, learn, and change was lost.
Thank you, Brother Brock. We'd like to invite Taneed Austin to read a written statement.
I'm Taneed, and I'm on the leadership of Delco CPR, and I will be sharing Eddie's story. Can you hear me? Eddie shared his story with our team in June of this year. His experience highlights conditions at George Hill, as well as the need for cash bail reform. Eddie spent a single episode of residency at George Hill from March to July of 2017. His charges were related to corruption of minors, CMOM, for which the judge imposed cash bail in the amount of $100,000. Eddie was unable to make bail and stayed incarcerated for 16 weeks, resulting in job loss and extended separation from family and loved ones. He was innocent of the crime for which he was charged and was ultimately acquitted. Eddie described his experience at George Hill's intake block with a mixture of anger, horror, and disgust. He was locked in a holding tank for over 5 hours, along with 6 other people. The cell was filthy and smelled terrible due to a hole in the middle of the floor that inmates were forced to urinate and defecate in. There was urine and feces on the floor and lots of flies and gnats flying around. It was filthy and humiliating because there was no privacy. If you had to go to the bathroom in that disgusting hole, you had to do it in front of everyone else who was there. Eddie also shared, and our team has confirmed, that inmates going through intake are charged a $100 processing fee. In his case, Eddie had $103 on him at the time of his arrest, but when he initially tried to buy commissary items, he was told that didn't have enough money in his account because $100 was taken out for his processing fee. Eddie clarified that if an inmate arrives at the jail without the required $100 Any money they receive on their account from family or friends will be garnished from their account until the processing fee is paid off in full. At the time of his arrest, Eddie was suffering from several medical conditions, including arthritis in his knees, requiring a knee brace and pain medication, and an eye condition requiring daily eye drops. Since medications cannot be bought in at the time of arrest, Eddie was evaluated by medical staff at intake. Eddie said staff members made several phone calls to outside physicians to verify his medical needs and assured him that he would get all his proper medical needs met. Eddie followed all procedures and submitted numerous sick call slips to go see medical staff. He said he only received his proper medications intermittently, and his medically required leg brace was taken from him at intake. Eddie indicated that his medical care at George Hill was so bad that he was forced to undergo surgery following his release. Eddie has many concerns about issues and conditions at George Hill. He confessed to feeling as though no one there cared or listened. He felt that corrections staff were frequently openly hostile and confrontational, and that he and the other inmates there were disrespected and treated like animals. His primary critique of this facility was its failure to provide proper medical attention and medications to its inmate population. Eddie also described the failure of corrections staff to follow institutional policies with dire consequences. He recounted episodes when heavy rains frequently caused plumbing issues that were not repaired, and there were 2 inches of water on the cell floor. Eddie also described an incident in which a guard from another cell block came to his pod, went into another inmate's cell unaccompanied, a violation of policy, and punched the inmate in the face. In general, Eddie describes George Hill as a place where, quote, no one cares or listens, where there is nothing to do, and where inmates are set up to fail, end quote. He said that with the exception of church and an offenders class, there were no educational or therapeutic programs available to him or other inmates on his cell block. Although there were 3 day room periods each day for 1.5 hours each, there was nothing to do but watch TV and play cards or board games. Additionally, Eddie indicated that there was a law library and a gymnasium, but if the guards didn't let you out of your cell during the brief period when these activities were called, you were not allowed to attend. Eddie said that George Hill is chronically understaffed, and this lack of personnel frequently curtailed inmate visiting privileges. In addition, visitors were frequently strip searched in the restroom, and at times were prevented from coming onto the facility based on prior convictions that were 45 to 50 years old. In closing, here are a few direct quotes from Eddie. Even though people are arrested, they shouldn't be treated like animals. I used to love going to the zoo, but now I'll never go again. You don't mistreat people just because you're in charge. They set you up to fail there. A nonpartisan agency should send people in there unannounced so they can see what really goes on in there.
Is Ken Prescott in attendance? No? Thank you. We'd like to invite Susan Keller to read a written statement.
Hi, I'm Susan Keller, and I will be reading a statement from Kenneth Prescott, a former correction officer at George W. Hill Correctional Facility. This is his first-hand account. The reason for this letter is based on my experiences with the company. I've experienced so many unsafe and hostile moments working in the jail. Many of my fellow officers are extremely verbally abusive toward the inmates. This creates a very hostile and dangerous environment for all the officers. I've seen the officers insult, agitate, and even take away privileges for no legitimate reason. For example, one officer verbally abused an inmate to the point the inmate wanted to fight him but couldn't because he was handcuffed. This happened right in front of a sergeant, and the officer was not stopped, verbally reprimanded, or disciplined. I've seen officers, mainly female, lock inmates in their cells because they don't like them. I've seen inmates claim to be sick and officers ignore their claims. This is every day. I've experienced an inmate in tears from pain, could barely speak, and said he hasn't eaten in 2 days. He showed me an abscess in his mouth causing his tooth to ache. I first informed the control officer on duty and she said, "Fuck him." I then informed the sergeant when he came on the unit and his reply was, "Fuck him." I experienced an inmate on SMU while conducting an ASA being purposefully denied food because he wasn't ready to eat when it was served. The inmate asked for his food 3 times during my tour of about 6 hours total before I notified the sergeant because the key holding officer kept saying, "Fuck." Keep in mind this inmate is severely mentally unstable. They starved him for 6 hours. It's things like this that produce a hostile environment. It's got to stop. I've been hearing about Code Black incidents since my date of hire, and my observation of the inhumane behavior of my fellow officers is the main cause. This makes me weary to come to work. I feel I will be a victim because of the savage verbal, mental, and psychological abuse my fellow officers inflict on the inmates. This is not what I was trained to do during my 5 weeks of training by Lieutenant Lodehold, Captain McCarthy, and CO Bennett. Being weary to come to work is a feeling I never felt until my experience with George W. Hill. I understand the last officer attacked was beaten severely by a group of inmates on Unit 10. Once again, I'm sure it's based on the officer's conduct or the history of his fellow officers' abusive conduct. This was a horrible experience.
Thank you, Susan. We have one final written statement from Sophia Henler. I should say, Sophia was supposed to be in attendance today and had a family emergency, so we met, our story collection team met with her a couple weeks ago, so we're working from some notes about her experience that she had hoped to share today.
Thanks, Heather. Yes. So we don't have a fully written personal statement from Sophia, and I feel like the bullet points that she sent me and my sort of recollection, which is not the best, will not do full justice to Sophia's experience, but I do want to share a little bit of her experience. So Sophia wrote, "Hi, my name is Sophia, and I was incarcerated at George Hill from February 2nd, 2017 to March 22nd, 2017. The reason for my incarceration was a DUI. It was my first DUI, but the highest tier, and it was on January 28th. I was immediately bench warranted due to the fact that I had been on probation for several years and was on probation at the time of the DUI. Despite the fact that it was my first and only violation, I was still put in jail until further notice. I would like to elaborate on my experience and treatment in George Hill. And one thing that stands out from my conversation with her a bit ago was that initially Sophia had been sent to Montgomery County and was there for a handful of days before she was transferred to George Hill. And in our conversation, she really stressed how different her experience was at the two settings. So a few things that Sophia mentioned. It took the corrections officers over 2 weeks to distribute my medicine, even though upon entering the prison, I was taking them daily. I spent over a week in the intake block, and that was a big difference between the two settings, where she was seen for evaluation at Montgomery County within 24 hours, and at George Hill it took days before she was even evaluated. The intake block is also known as the hold, And it's a 23-1, which is the ratio of how many hours you're in the cell and how many hours you actually get to leave to go to the block room or outside. So 23 hours in the cell and 1 hour out. I slept on the ground next to the toilet in every cell that I was in. That was 3 total, including the intake cell. The lights never fully turned out. It was almost torture. Bright neon lights constantly. And the only hope to get sleep was to put as many of your clothing or paper over your eyes as possible. I personally got written up and was threatened to be thrown in the hole for 60 days after trying to cover the light above with paper. The corrections officers provoked many fights among inmates, clearly favored some and disliked others, and actually had intimate relationships with some. And that was another piece of Sophia's experience that felt very different when talking about what was hardest for her in the 2 places was that she felt more unsafe with the corrections officers at George Hill than she did with the fellow inmates. That's all I have of Sophia's story, but it doesn't fully do honor to her experience, but she did want it shared.
Thank you, Michele. On behalf of the story collecting team and Delco CPR, I want to thank you sincerely to all of you who have shared stories and experiences today. We're deeply grateful for your courage and willingness to share with the public. We also hope that your stories make a difference and bring to light some of the changes that are needed at George W. Hill. Your stories are all unique, but carry some similar threads about the need for more humane treatment at this facility, including but certainly not limited to more prompt access to medical care, better mental health treatment, better access to and treatment for visitors, and improved access to educational and rehabilitative programming. We also want to see an end to mistreatment and abuse and some of the disgusting, inhumane, violent conditions that have been described at George W. Hill Correctional Facility.